Welcome back. Let's first learn how to estimate the cost of debt, which is usually easier than the cost of equity. We shall first learn the cost of issuing debt securities, the cost of bank debt, and the cost of leasing. We'll end with a short discussion on the international considerations when estimating the cost of debt. Let's begin. The easiest way to estimate the cost of debt for a company is to study the yield to maturity of its publicly traded bonds. It should be a straight bond, that is, it has no embedded options. It should preferably have the longest maturity. But if that bond is not frequently traded, the yield to maturity might not be that indicative of what the market expects. In such a case, the yield of a shorter term but more liquid bond may be used. However, many companies issue non-traded bonds, or all its bonds may be too illiquid. The quoted yields of such bonds, if available, may be unreliable estimates of the cost of debt because of the presence of a large liquidity premium. If the debt security carries a debt rating, you may use the yields and maturities of liquid bonds issued by similar companies with similar ratings to perform matrix pricing. You've learnt this in the Level 1 fixed income course. For example, if the subject bond has 8 years to maturity, and these are the yields and maturities of liquid traded bonds with the same credit rating, we can estimate the yield of the subject bond using linear interpolation. Work it out based on similar triangles, we get an estimated yield of 9.5% for the subject bond. The cost of debt for the company is estimated to be 9.5%. If no credit rating exists, the company's financial leverage ratios, such as the interest coverage ratio or debt-to-asset ratio, may be used to estimate a synthetic credit rating for the bond using a model. Once a credit rating has been inferred, we can use the matrix pricing approach to estimate the cost of debt. Another approach is to determine the current credit spread for that credit rating and maturity, and add on a risk-free rate to arrive at the cost of debt for the subject company. Bank debt is another source of debt financing for many companies. The interest rate paid by the company on a new bank loan may be a good estimate of the cost of debt for the company. The interest rate on new bank loan will most likely reflect current market conditions and the current creditworthiness of the subject company. Besides the cost of debt securities and the cost of bank debt, leasing can also be seen as a form of borrowing. In particular, we're referring to finance leases, also known as capital leases. If you recall from Level 1, a finance lease on an asset can be thought of as a purchase on the asset financed with debt. The accounting is somewhat equivalent to the lessee taking a loan from the lessor and using the entire proceeds to purchase the asset at fair value from the lessor. Do note that this is more like a secured loan by the lessor, as the property can be seen as the collateral which will be returned if the lessee is unable to keep up with the lease payments. As such, the interest rate implicit in this secured loan can be seen as the cost of secured debt for the lessor. We call this the rate implicit in the lease. This implicit rate is the discount rate in the following equation. It may be easier to understand this from a timeline. Let's say the lease is for 3 years, with annual payments of $2.8 million at the end of each year. At the end of the lease, the asset has a residual value of $4 million. At the initiation of the lease, the fair value of the asset plus the costs the lessor paid to prepare the asset for lease should be equal to the sum of the PV of the leased asset and the PV of the residual value. So let's say the fair value of the property is $9 million and the lessor incurred a cost of $1 million at initiation. We should find the discount rate that solves this equation. Using TVM calculator, the PV is the initial cash flow, that is the sum of the fair value of the asset plus the costs, number of periods is 3, the lease payment is $2.8 million, and the residual value is $4 million. The discount rate that solves this is 9.85%. The implied interest rate of the lease is 9.85%. However, the residual value to the lessor is usually not disclosed. If unknown, the incremental borrowing rate, which is the rate of interest the lessee would pay to borrow using a collateralized loan over the same term, might be used to estimate the cost of leasing for the firm. And lastly, let's quickly look at international considerations. Theoretically, 2 identical companies with the same credit risk should have the same cost of debt. However, if their bonds were issued in different markets and in different currencies, the cost of debt could be very different due to country-specific factors like the economic conditions, political risk, exchange rate risk, and the level of investor protection in the securities market. The country risk rating is assigned to a country based on all these factors. In this example, we use numbers to label each class, where 1 is the lowest risk. For each rating class, the median interest rate can be calculated. By comparing the median interest rate with a benchmark country's rate, the country risk premium can be derived. For example, the country risk premium for country J is calculated as its median interest rate minus the benchmark country's interest rate. This table is an example of the country risk premium for 5 different countries, where country U is the benchmark, so its country risk premium is 0. And that's all you need to know about estimating the cost of debt. Next, we'll learn how to estimate the equity risk premium and the cost of equity. See you again.